5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live, coming to you live as Lichtman Live. Say what's up to the people, Dad. Another great guest today, Dad.
We have a great show for you today. You don't have to listen to me for an hour. We have a phenomenal guest, Professor Renée DiResta, who is, in my view, the world's leading authority on something we've talked about so many times on this show, and that is disinformation, its role in today's politics and today's society. And disinformation is very much in the news today with the Senate approval of the nomination of RFK Jr. to head Health and Human Services, to be the chief health officer of the United States. And I know Renée has written about this, and I intend to ask her about that when we get to the Q&A.
You're right, Dad. She has written about this. So Professor Renée DiResta is an associate research professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Previously, she was the technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She's an expert on misinformation, disinformation, rumors, and propaganda, and how narratives spread across social and media networks. She's the author of the book Invisible Rulers: The People Who Turned Lies into Reality. I read the book. I honestly believe every American should read this book. I want everybody watching to go to Amazon right now and buy the book. Renée, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
All right. So the nomination and approval of RFK Jr. is very much in the news. We know you know a lot about that. And so my question is, what was the role of disinformation in the Senate approving and Trump nominating someone who is a purveyor of quack science, a purveyor of misinformation that costs people's lives about vaccines? And should we take in any way seriously what any nominee says at a hearing, since once they're in office, they can
They do
forget
whatever they
about all
want.
of it?
It's a great question. Thanks for having me on. I started the book with a story that kind of involves, meeting RFK Jr. actually for the first time back in 2015. I wasn't in academia then. I had my first baby in 2013, and there was a measles outbreak in California. He was not old enough to be vaccinated fully when that happened. He hadn't gotten his measles shot yet, not yet a year old. I had a measles exposure on BART, the subway in San Francisco. I was really irritated about it. I'd moved from New York, where the vaccination rate was much higher, and I was really surprised to find out that San Francisco had these pockets of very, very low vaccination rates. And so I wound up, calling my local congressman to complain, which I'd never done before, but I didn't know what you were supposed to do in that situation. And I said, is there anything we can do to help with this, to up vaccination rates so that we don't have measles outbreaks in San Francisco in 2014? And they said, no, there isn't really. There's nothing, there's not a lot that we can do. We're going to try to introduce some legislation, but the anti-vaccine movement, they're very, very good at thwarting legislation, but, we'll see what we can do. We can't do anything locally. It'll have to be at the level of the state of California. So I got involved in trying to pass that legislation at the state level. And my job was to be like the social media person. There was a group of us. We started a group called Vaccinate California, just a handful of moms. Everybody kind of had specialized skills. One had been a legislative assistant to Senator Feinstein. One was a lawyer, a couple nurses, graphic designer. Everybody had skills, and we decided we were going to make a Facebook page. And what we found was that the social media conversation in 2015 was just overwhelmingly anti-vaccine. There was just nothing that you could do to break through. And we decided that what we were going to have to do was, we were not going to preach to the converted. We were going to try to reach other people. And it was, I don't want to spend too much time on the story. We did eventually get this bill passed, but it was a really eye-opening experience realizing just how large the anti-vaccine groups had gotten on Facebook. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was very much a figurehead, like a messiah figure in the movement. He's a very charismatic speaker. He's a, you know, he reflects back to people what they want to hear, you know. He tells them that he will listen to them and he will hear them when the medical establishment and science will not. The Most of these people believe that vaccines cause autism. That is the core, the root core of the anti-vaccine movement. Very much still believes that. It is not true, but they believe that the science is rigged. The government has rigged it. The government is throwing out data that, you know, that would prove the opposite, or that would disprove the, would kind of show that what they believe to be true is true. And as all of this is happening, what you see is like the the bond between this influential figure, the crowd of people who want to believe this thing, and the person who is telling them what they want to hear. And that's how you see this movement really begin. That's the seed of it. And as we move into COVID, what you see is that audience for anti-vaccine content really expanding. Because when we were fighting this fight in 2015, the people who cared about vaccination rates in kindergarten were parents, not the entirety of California. But by the time you get to COVID, the entire world is paying attention. And that's how you start to see that same dynamic, right? Of people hearing what they want to hear, people who are afraid and they think that the health institutions aren't speaking to them. And then you have these figures who tell them what they want to hear, and then who become, you know, as their social media companies try to respond. Sometimes they get kicked off. In Kennedy's case, he did. But that just makes them more appealing. Right now, they're the purveyors of forbidden knowledge. They've got a secret that nobody else knows, and they become even more popular. Why would they try to silence him if he wasn't telling a forbidden truth? And you see the movement continue to grow, and you see his appeal continue. So it's not as simple as disinformation. I think you have to think about it maybe a little bit more as rumors. You know, stories about vaccines that pass from person to person. That was how we described what we saw during COVID. Disinformation usually implies that the message is intentionally wrong. In the case of the anti-vaccine movement, it is a sincerely held belief. They
You
are
think
not out
RFK
there.
really believes this stuff?
Absolutely, 100%.
Really?
I
Really?
absolutely do. Yes, I absolutely 100% do. And that is why I think he is actually a terrible, terrible HHS secretary. If it was just something that was performative and done to,
Right.
you know, earn money
Oh,
on social media,
Wow.
then that would be the sort of thing where, you know, I would think, okay, you know, like grifters, right? They do what they do. But no, this is a person who really, truly, as far as I can tell, over 10 years now of watching his social media content. I'm a subscriber to Children's Health Defense. I read that newsletter every day,
wow.
right? You know, part of my job is understanding the narratives that are making
Yes.
their way around. I watched the Samoa measles outbreak that got referenced in real time as it happened, as all of those things played out, as 85 children under the age of 5
In a
died.
tiny, tiny population.
Yes, yes. I mean, what happened there was atrocious. It was egregious. And what I think went wrong in the United States is that you have the debt, maybe we could call it the trust debt of COVID, leading people to be looking for something and to latch on to this as a, you know, more of like a messiah of change than any kind of specific thing they're looking for. I was actually arguing about him today in a group chat with a bunch of friends, people
Yeah.
who have very, very, very different political beliefs. And we're all in this group chat. And, you know, the one rule is that it stays respectful. And I called him an extremist, and somebody thought that wasn't respectful, you know?
What?
And I laid out, you know, here's why I think that actually is a completely fair term. And I mean that in the sense of, you know, a true believer. But what this person said was, you know, I wanted something that would be a shock. I wanted something that would be a shock to the system. I don't believe the autism thing, but I want something that will lead to change on all of these other things that are wrong. And this is the wrecking ball that I think I'm going to get. So, you know, that particular person was very optimistic about this. And, you know, I think that's where you're seeing this tension between very, very divergent realms of trust.
Let me ask you this.
Mhm.
So he says in his hearings, "Oh no, I'm not really anti-vax." But what
Oh,
you're
I don't
telling
believe that for a
me,
second.
that's nonsense.
That's absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
100%. He means that, so he doesn't consider himself anti-vaccine, but he holds the beliefs of an anti-vaxxer. This is, you know, there
Exactly.
are, and this is a question of, what labels do you assign to yourself versus ones that are
Right.
assigned to you? How do you see yourself internally versus externally? There's
Yeah.
people, you encounter this all the time. People's perception of you is different than
Sure.
than what you think. And he thinks that the science has, the good science has not been done. And the interactions to watch very closely are the interactions with Senator Bill Cassidy. I watched his confirmation hearings, and the interactions to watch were really the ones with Cassidy, because that's where you
The doctor,
have
right?
the
Cassidy.
doctor. Um, Cassidy he didn't really engage very much on the vaccine issue. What was very interesting was that he tried to draw him out more on the health and human services stuff. How are you, Medicare, Medicaid, right? These
Which you knew
massive
nothing
programs,
about, right?
which he knew nothing about. And this again, my read on that was he was trying to open the door to show that this is a person who is foundationally unqualified on entirely different levels than the vaccine question, which is now a third rail. Maybe we can talk about the qualifications to administer a massive government agency. But in the end, there was a very, very large pressure campaign on Cassidy, right? People calling and showing up. The hearing room was packed. I don't know if you saw that. Both of the times the hearing room was packed. The anti-vaccine movement is very good at turning out its people. And candidly, the pro-vaccine, there is no pro-vaccine movement. Maybe now there will be. Maybe maybe not, because when it's the norm, when most people go and vaccinate their kids and don't think twice about it, there is nothing to advocate for. It's a
Right.
normal
It's
behavior.
routine. Yeah.
Right. And so now I think you might see, depending on the policies, if he governs the way his base is expecting him to, or maybe governs not the word, I don't know, administers the way his base is expecting him to, then I think maybe it actually will galvanize a pro-vaccine movement in the United States.
That would be interesting to see.
You have some questions?
I'm just, I don't want to fearmonger, but you know him so well and you followed him for so long. I mean, how?
Well, I don't know him personally.
Well,
at
you don't
all.
know him personally.
I met him once for like 5 seconds.
You've studied him. Maybe that's a better term. You've studied him.
The movement. I mean,
Studied
the movement is
okay.
it's an interesting movement, but he's very prominent because he is.
And he's got the magic name. Let's not forget that.
Yeah,
That name
true.
means a lot.
There's a real charisma there. He's also very good at social media. This is something that a lot of a lot of other people aren't. A lot of institutional folks aren't. You have a podcast, you do it, like you're out there constantly. But it's a little bit rarer, I think, for for the average CDC scientist to say like, okay, I'm going to go live now and talk about something, let alone, videotape his workout or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
We've talked about that a lot on this show.
yeah.
You can put out a lie about vaccines, about abortion, anything you want, half a sentence. But to debunk it is so much harder. You got to cite all this evidence and analyses, and people blear out by the time you're halfway through. There's an old saying, a lie travels around the world before truth has a chance to put its pants on.
Yep.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to fearmonger, but I'm just curious your take of how concerned your average American should be that RFK Jr. is now the head of HHS.
I saw this interesting post on Blue Sky today that was somebody saying, in other countries, people set up shadow cabinets, sort of people who serve as like, you have the one particular party's in power and the other party goes and sets up a shadow cabinet, sort of mirroring basically, here's our Secretary of Health and Human Services, so you can look to this other person for for a point of view. I don't remember who wrote this post, but they said, the Democrats should name a shadow Secretary of Human Services like as soon as possible, just to create an alternate source of information for
That's
people.
not a bad idea.
It's
That's
really
I've
not.
been
That's not the worst idea
advocating
I've ever
that
heard.
for decades.
Yeah, it's
Since
a
I
really
developed
interesting.
my keys to the White House back in
Yeah.
1980. No one listens, but I've been advocating it.
I mean, it's a way, regardless of who's in power, I think it's a way to get that, what would the other team, if you will, be offering in this moment? And it's an interesting question.
Speaking of my dad's keys, Renee, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they were wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, they were wrong this year. And we
First time in 42 years.
Yeah.
And we have talked a lot about maybe why. My dad went public and he said that it was because of misinformation and
One of the
disinformation.
things. It wasn't the only thing. I also talked about
Well,
the Democrats' big mistakes.
true.
Yeah.
I guess our question to you is, do you think, or rumors as you put it, propaganda, disinformation, whatever term you want to use, do you think that was powerful enough this time to discredit something like the keys, which is sort of rooted in precedent?
I'm familiar with the keys. How do you think the like, what was your specific argument? I remember reading this, but I don't remember the specifics.
Yeah. For example, people had widespread disinformation about the economy. And I thought
Okay.
the biggest disinformation was on abortion. And 66% of voters in the exit polls were pro-choice, a 35-point gap between pro-choice and pro-life. And yet the
Interesting.
gap between Harris and Trump on abortion was 3 points. 3 points, 10% of the true gap. If it had just been 10 points, not 35, Harris would have won the
Right.
election. So those are a couple of examples. And people thinking, immigrants are out to slit your throat. They're these horrible criminals, when in fact every study show they are the most law-abiding segment of our society for good reason, because they don't want to get involved in the criminal justice system, or the idea that all this disaster aid has been diverted to migrants, or
Right.
Ukraine started the war. I can go on and on.
I think the how do you then how does that weight then in the particular keys?
Well, certainly the perceptions of the economy
Right.
affected two of my keys. I have a
Yeah.
short-term and long-term economic keys. Short-term based on the National Bureau of Economic Research declaring a recession and 75 to 80% of Americans agreeing with that. And then a long-term key based upon long-term GDP growth. I also have a foreign policy failure and foreign policy success key,
Interesting.
which
Okay.
certainly would be affected there.
One thing that one thing that's very interesting that has been increasing is this divergence in what sources people trust and in what media people pay attention to. It's much more this is not a real word, but nicheified. The fragmentation is there. I use the term niche because it's hard to figure out what to call it, but it's groups of influencers speaking to people who are very much aligned in a particular identity, usually a particular political identity. Factions is the other word I use sometimes, usually when they're activated. But the interesting thing about the niches is they're very kind of like resistant to correction from the outside, right?
Exactly.
So that's I think the biggest challenge. I think it gets processed as an information challenge. I think it should be processed as a trust challenge,
Yes.
because if you're screaming, you can say like, no, look, here's this meticulous. Actually, do you remember the eating the pets? Remember they're eating the pets.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Of course.
Definitely.
I,
Who doesn't remember
every
that?
We talked about that quite a bit.
Okay, every time I give a talk, I start by asking people in the room, like, "Do you know what QAnon is?" Like, where let's level set on how extremely online people actually are. But eating the pets was an interesting one. If I was like writing the book today, it would have been a case study in there, because it was exactly it was exactly the casebook textbook study of a random online rumor from a Facebook group by a person who, again, sincerely, truly, deeply believed that something had happened to her neighbor's cat and that the most logical explanation was the Haitian neighbors, right? And we can talk about what that reflects and all these other things, but that is, again, a true believer right there. And she shared it completely, honesty. There's no disinformation there. This is what she thinks has happened. And other people begin to comment on that, to share it. And this is what happens on the internet. It gets decontextualized, it's screenshotted, it's taken out of the Facebook group, and it makes it to Twitter. The minute that happens, people no longer have any idea who this person is, what this story is. The context is stripped. They don't know the community. They don't know anything about it. All of a sudden, it becomes something that is like there for the consumption of anybody who can make it useful, right? And oftentimes what you see happen then is it gets twisted ever so slightly, right? And what you see the next person say is, you see, I told you guys, I said that the refugees and the immigrants were taking the ducks out of the public parks and nobody believed me, but not only are they taking the ducks, they're also taking the cats, right? And that's the tweet. And this starts to go viral because that's a crazy claim. And people hear it and it resonates with them. And this is how rumors spread. Think about, you hear something salacious and you tell your friend who tells their friend who tells their friend. That's what's happening on Twitter. It's not disinformation. It's a rumor, right? It's people who are sharing it because they believe it and because they've heard it, and this, we call it like friend of a friend, oh, I heard it, my friend's cat got eaten by Haitians is how this goes. These like apocryphal tales. But what happens next is where it becomes a propaganda campaign, right? And this is where powerful political influencers recognize what this story can do for them. And it's not just a story about immigrants and a missing cat anymore. All of a sudden, it's a story about who has the right to be in that community. What are they doing to the good people of that community who were there first, right? What are we saying about safety in that community? Why is nobody listening to this community? The unheard people of this community are losing their cats, right? And then JD Vance picks it up. And then all of a sudden it's hit the sort of highest levels. It's been traded all the way up the chain to the point where it becomes a propaganda campaign. And it also, being the internet, has this element of the surreal. And so people start saying Donald Trump is going to save the cats and the ducks. And that's where they start making the memes. And then all of a sudden you have this entire visual language that goes along with it of people making cats and ducks. And then people are participating, right? They're excited by it. And some of those cat and duck memes get retweeted by prominent influencers. Some of them get reposted by Donald Trump himself. And all of a sudden you have this entire universe of they're eating the pets. And then two things happen. One, Donald Trump goes on a national televised debate and says they're eating the pets on a debate. And all of a sudden this is decontextualized from Twitter on the internet. So now we're like several layers away. And what you see in the Google search trends data is people being like, eating the pets. They're looking for it on Google. They're trying to figure out what the hell is this man talking about. It becomes a meme. People think he's crazy, right? People who are not extremely online are like, the hell is this eating the pets thing? And so it becomes then a source of ridicule on the left, which continues the conversation. But the Wall Street Journal, which is not a lefty paper at all, sends reporters to Springfield, gets information. The governor, who is a Republican, says this is not happening. The mayor says this is not happening. Prominent business leaders in the town say this is not happening. And they don't believe the correction because it's not about the actual facts. They're not actually talking about people eating pets.
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot, that you can present actual facts, but the problem is they never get there. It's the deep state. It's the leftists, it's the commies, it's the gays, whoever. And so we don't even consider that information because we know it's tainted from the start.
And what's interesting, though, is JD Vance made a very kind of revealing comment in which he said, the story is what's important.
Right. It's indicative of what's going on,
Yeah.
even though it may not be exactly
It may not be
right.
true.
Yeah, but it's indicative. It's
But
symbolic of
thematically,
everything. Yes, exactly.
And
that gets you off the hook. That way you can say anything.
Right. But that, I think, is where I don't know how it fits into the Keyes model exactly, but it is the problem where you can make that phenomenon happen and it happens over and over and over again. And like every time I think about, okay, if I'm giving a talk or writing an essay or whatever, there was Hurricane Helene and I could tell the story about FEMA. There was Hurricane Milton,
Yep.
they're like, it doesn't matter what it is. It's a process. Now it's USAID, right? We've just gutted a government agency.
Yeah.
Nobody was talking about USAID before a month ago. Nobody in that community.
Nobody.
I don't know what
that.
you.
Speaking of disinformation,
It's just like
the American people on average thought we spend 31% of the federal budget on foreign aid, when the truth is it's under 1%.
Yeah, and it's
So
just
we attack aid, sure. Oh yeah, we're throwing all this money away that could be spent here.
But again, you have the what was, the wild one there was like $50 million for condoms in Gaza, right? Which became $50 million for condoms for Hamas, right?
Yeah.
And these rumors go viral, and then somebody asked Elon Musk about it when he was in the Oval Office giving a press conference.
I was just about to ask
which
you
was
about
also
this.
weird.
I was just about to ask you about this when he said, "Oh, I'm going to say things that aren't true," right?
That
So,
aren't
yeah.
true, right? And again, you get to this. Well, okay, but the people who trust you have already decided it is, right? And this is where the problem of, like, I think of my work as looking at how propaganda and influence work, or how narrative spread, or how public opinion is shaped. I work a lot on like how the structure of the internet makes these things happen more or less. Just I'm kind of interested in system design, but I don't know, from a what do you do about it standpoint.
What's your assessment of how the mainstream media has dealt with all of this?
They do what they're good at, right? Like the Wall Street Journal's reporting on that eating the pets thing was great. I mean, it was fantastic. There's a couple of reporters at NBC. Brandy Zadrozny comes to mind, who's been covering RFK Jr. For God, 7 years. I think I've read her coverage, and um, she's in this interesting position where she covers him, with high quality reporting, telling the story of who he is, deep in depth reported interviews. But how do you make it reach people?
Yeah.
How do you make
Well,
them
here's the
care?
problem I had with the mainstream media coverage of the election, among others,
Yeah, go
that
ahead.
they spent 20 times more time on meaningless polls that they covered virtually every hour, that were all within the margin of error, that told you nothing, that enlightened nobody. 20 times more time on that than speaking truth to power.
I think they struggle with their, I don't know, brand is the word. One of the things that influencer media needs, and it might not need it forever, but a lot of political influencer media needs to set itself up adversarially against something else. Because the way that you appeal to a niche, the way that you draw that audience is by being different than all of the other things that that audience could be paying attention to. And when you have to be competing for attention, you do it maybe by being more extreme, funnier, willing to say the thing no one will say. Maybe you're just, you're making higher quality content, you're more attractive, a whole bunch of different ways in which that could happen. But one of the very common refrains is, particularly on the right, they are lying to you, right? They are
Right.
lying to you. They are not telling you the truth. I am telling you the truth. Or media is dead. Media is dead. We are the media now, which is reinforcing that sense of like it's us against them. It's always us against them. And that puts media in a challenging spot because it responds by trying to be even more neutral, even more non-biased,
Yeah,
even
more
more careful.
both-sidish.
Yeah, and then funny enough, and then in turn it winds up alienating the left, which then sees it as it's not, fulfilling its responsibility, appropriately contextualizing this or that. This headline is bad, et cetera, et cetera. And it, so it does kind of get buffeted. And then what you'll see sometimes is the left will peel off also, and will go look for media that aligns with where, where the audience wants the tone to be. So
Well, here's
it,
something we've been talking about, I'd like your take on, and that is the fact that the media, so-called mainstream media, LA Times, Washington Post, the big networks, the cable outlets, are now either controlled by billionaires or big corporations. What are the implications of that?
also social media. We're not doing great here.
True.
Um, yeah, the it's it's I think very hard to run a business in media today. Um, you'll see interesting things happen, right? Sometimes people will hop off and go independent. Jen Rubin comes to mind. She resigned, I think, from WAPO.
Yeah, she quit.
Um, and she started a Substack with Norm Eisen called The Contrarian. You've seen it. Been a few big peel offs. Chuck Todd recently left. Um, I'm very
NBC.
NBC. Thanks. I'm so bad at network TV. There's I don't have a TV, right? This is one of the problems. I watch it when I'm in hotels, and that's it. The the ecosystem is so fragmented. You are seeing this like this disassembly as talent is moving to being independent now. It realizes I can start a newsletter. If you start a Substack, you can upload video to Substack. Also, if you're on Instagram, you can do the same, you can do the same thing. You can put your content where you want it to be. You can establish community. You can do a podcast.
That's what
There's a
we're
lot of
doing.
different ways. Yeah.
Why we
Yeah.
have you here.
I mean, I write for a bunch of places. I've been thinking about, okay, I got to start doing video more because even though I don't love video, other people like video. And in the time it takes me to write a whole essay or explainer, which is going to take this much time for someone to read, I actually watched Mark Zuckerberg made a bunch of policy changes a couple of weeks back to Meta.
Oh, yeah.
This was a very big deal in tech policy land. And I did a bunch of I did some podcasts, I did some media hits, PBS and these other things, BBC, a bunch of them. And what was very interesting was that most of those outlets did not start by showing the clip. They asked me to describe. So he made these changes. Can you describe the changes to us? Which meant that part of what I talked about was like listing off these changes. And okay, it is what it is. But then I watched this very popular streamer give an assessment of the thing. And he literally put the clip up, played it on 1.5x speed, and every time Zuckerberg said something that he thought was wrong, disingenuous, misleading, or something that he just wanted to point to and offer an alternative viewpoint on, he just paused it, did a reaction next to it, offered his point of view, hit the play button, did it again, and in like 8 minutes, he'd sort of like gone through the entire thing, and he had something that was like clippable, shareable, engaging, funny, irreverent. And, and I thought I'd rather watch that than my
I hear you. Yeah,
my
that's a
very
person
detailed
way of
academic
doing things.
explainer. And that's because it made it entertaining. And that question of like, how do we engage, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been, for years slamming the Democrats and liberals, they have not developed a simple, compelling message that attracts people. I don't even know what their message is. And I follow these things. I'm an authority in the field. How would anyone,
Yep.
average Jane or Joe Doe have any idea what the Democrats' message is?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I think, and it's very diffuse. You have to capture attention. I think of the, whatever you think of her politics, I think AOC does a very good job of understanding how to use the medium. There's I remember watching her make pasta.
Yeah, she's good.
Yeah, she was making pasta. She just had the thing up and she's like, making the pasta. And I thought, it's so interesting. I feel like it's also a generational thing. If you kind of are of an age where that's totally a normal thing to do, like you're always on video anyway, you wouldn't think twice about it. I have 3 kids. The oldest is 11, the littlest is 4. And they record themselves on video singing. They record themselves on video to send clips to their grandparents. Before they could read, they knew how to use how to flip the camera and talk on video. They did Siri voice to navigate the web, right? Like it's such a different means of engaging versus people who are very much like text first internet. And it's just a foundationally different way of capturing attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into your book a little bit, Renee. The title, Invisible Rulers. Can you explain to the people what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, it's a reference to Edward Bernays, this book Propaganda from 1929. So Bernays had been a propagandist in World War I. And after World War I ended, he wrote this book. And propaganda wasn't really a pejorative then. It was sort of information with an agenda. And of course, the government had agendas. And of course, the government communicated its agenda to the public because Walter Lippmann was his contemporary at the time. How could the public be expected to stay on top of everything necessary, with so much information all around it? Sort of funny to hear in the age of the internet, but that was the prevailing perception in the early 1930s too. And he writes this book, Bernays writes this book, Invisible Rulers, because he's actually trying to create what becomes the discipline of public relations. Because he's basically arguing that companies should be doing this as well. And that there's an art to appealing to people in their identity as a member of a group. not who they are as an individual, but who they are as a member of a group, and that's an incredibly powerful way to engage with them. And he has a couple sentences where he describes invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. And he talks about how our minds are made up by people that we've never heard of and never seen. We think we're hearing the president or a local politician, but what we're really hearing is the words of a talented person behind them who understands how to appeal to the public. And he's basically arguing for the development of that kind of talent in advertising and in marketing. And he, in fact, goes on to be just that himself, right? He he pitches cigarettes to women as arguing that independent, liberated women smoke, right? So he creates the perception, and you see this in some of the movies and things that come out later of the sophisticated woman smokes, and specifically she smokes Virginia Slims, right? And so there's again, you're appealing to an aspiration, you're appealing to a sense of identity, you're appealing to a sense of self. And the invisible rulers are the people that he describes as being the molders of the public mind. And
Right.
I wanted to write about that in the context of influencers today, because I think that they're maybe, and after this election, maybe we're going to get there.
Yeah.
Definitely in election 2020, I was saying, like, I don't think people realize, like, just how critical this is as, like, a means of opinion shaping. And again, because it was really bringing people together around this idea that, like, we are the media, we are a community, we can do this, we are unified, and why do we need these institutions? Why do we need these things? It was a message of empowerment, but it also was empowerment that that also sought to kind of like tear down the very legitimacy of expertise.
Renee, have you discovered the invisible ruler behind Donald Trump?
He is an interesting character because he was an influencer, right? He was
Exactly.
I mean,
When he was in New York, he was
Yep.
a mighty influencer.
Yeah, I grew up in New York. I remember, everybody, he was the sort of literally the golden boy, right?
Tabloid king, they called him.
I am, I remember my grandma talking about him at the dinner table, right? There would always be these tabloid stories and things like that. And, he gradually inserted himself into politics. I remember going to, I worked on Wall Street for a while right when I got out of college. And, there would be these like Wall Street conferences and things that would be held at various Trump towers and Trump hotels and whatnot. And yeah, that he did The Apprentice, which was kind of before my time. I never watched it, but it was a very big formative thing, I think, for a lot of the people who vote for him. There's
Your mom watched it, right, Sam?
My mom was she doesn't like Trump, but she was a huge Apprentice fan. Yeah.
Now she hates Trump, of course, but
Right.
yeah. No,
But
it was,
I think we also go ahead. Sorry.
He felt familiar, I think, right? He didn't have to establish himself. There's this, this is not the kind of work that I do, but in the realm of like psychology influence, like people who study that intersection, there's the idea of like the parasocial relationship. The so parasociality is like people who feel like they know the influencer, even though the influencer has no idea who they are, right? And it's, the fandom, the idea of fantasy, this really incredibly passionate group of people who absolutely adore somebody because there's this idealization and also a strong feeling that there's some sort of bidirectional relationship. So when he says, like, I represent you, there's this, that sort of pre-established potentially.
as laughable as it is that these billionaires actually represent ordinary Americans.
Right.
Sam, should we go to questions? Are you able to stay, or
Yeah, I
are
can
you?
stay for a bit. Yeah.
What's your cutoff time, Renee? Just so I know.
Maybe probably 10.
10. Okay.
What time? I don't know what time it is
About
there for you.
when we go to.
Yeah.
Okay.
They can ask questions to both of us.
Yeah. So we obviously we're live, so people are putting questions in the chat for you. Actually,
I can't see the chat, so
no,
I'll let you read them.
I'll read
You
them
got
to you.
it.
Don't worry. But I have a question of my own first. I think what most interested me about the book was, I'm 32. I'm sort of part of this generation that has. I mean, I was a little bit before. I went to high school before there was even Instagram or any of that stuff. But I was part of the come up of this. And when you talk about invisible rulers, what interests me is this new age, this new media, right? The political influencer, the influencer generally speaking. And even though they might have millions of followers, like if I was to name 20 political influencers to my dad, I don't think he would know a single one, right? So like
I
this
would too.
What's that?
I know Joe Rogan.
He knows Joe Rogan. Okay. But yeah, this idea that they're not necessarily invisible anymore, but I've heard the term like famous to you before, right? Describing these type of influencers. And I get a little frustrated with them because you say in your book, right, that they present themselves as this David versus Goliath, right, for this neat narrative that they're David and the legacy media is Goliath. But you say that's deeply untruthful, and this new independent media is sort of this fifth estate. They wish to represent themselves as the anti-elite, but they're actually just the new elite.
Yeah.
And it's interesting.
You can't have 12 million followers,
right,
and pretend that you are some plucky David.
Right.
But sorry if I cut you off.
No, you're good. It's interesting because a lot of these political influencers have really gone after my dad. Like,
interesting.
Especially, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like Hassan Piker or Cenk Uygur.
I have.
Yeah.
Hassan Piker, yes, not.
Yeah.
No reason to be, believe me.
My dad knows them.
Was it because of the keys or because of the, like, what was the reason?
So, like,
a little bit of both, because of the keys, because I was predicting Harris, and because I call myself a progressive with a libertarian streak. My motto is there's too much government intruding in our private lives and too little government meeting our needs.
Here's my take, Renee. My take is that my dad, again, represented this Goliath to them, this established media personality. Even though my dad is just a professor, he's never.
But I'm all over the media.
But he's been on the media for a long time, and whenever he makes his prediction, the media sort of makes him their golden boy. And I think they got upset about that, maybe even jealous about that. But again, they saw him as this Goliath of legacy media.
And they think they can promote themselves by going after me.
Right,
that happens a lot. Yeah, the attack is.
But I also think too that the keys, because they're so simple and at least they were grounded in such a kind of concrete base, it kind of made their job irrelevant, right? Like people like Hassan and people like Cenk, they sit there all day long pontificating about politics, these pseudo events that you talk about, creating their bespoke realities that you talk about,
constantly contradicting themselves,
right? And the keys sort of fundamentally go against everything that they do, that they make their money from. I don't know if you agree or what your take on that is.
Hassan's an interesting. He's very good at capturing attention and speaking to like a particular base, and and being he's very engaging. He's also incredibly well known and came out of the Young Turks and has a whole history. But I think the social media really lends itself. I think I mentioned this in the book. There's a phrase that my friend Venkatesh Rao came up with a while back, the Internet of Beefs, where
right.
Yeah, where it's an amazing essay. I have to say it really did hold up. Where he basically makes the argument that the fandoms exist a lot of the time to go fight the other influencers, and Hassan, you'll occasionally see, there'll be these like weird streamer beefs where like it's impossible to follow. Like there's like him, there's Destiny, there's like all these these various people. There's the like second order, like the whole orbiter culture. There's the whole thing is so really candidly, it's like impossible to follow if you're not really like in it. And that's that famous to you thing. But there's there's like awards and stuff for for all like for communities and subcultures, for people who are like Twitch has its all the whole subculture, the streamers. I remember there was this sort of kind of funny, again, this is one of these things where you're going to sound crazy when you say it out loud. It's one of these famous to you things, but there was this like Gen Z streamer called Connor Eats Pants who did this he has this thing called Fortnite Fridays where he plays Fortnite with somebody for a couple hours on Friday night and interviews them.
You're saying so many words my dad has no clue what. How many of those words did you understand, Dad? None?
But I feel like you
doesn't matter.
But you know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what was kind of amazing about it was like there was this guy that everybody thought was Elon Musk on Twitter. He went by the name Adrian Dittman, and this was like a whole Twitter subculture, like just this weird conspiracy theory that you would not know unless you were extremely into like niche X lore. And so you had like the Connor Eats Pants manages to get Adrian Dittman onto this Fortnite stream. And then all of these people are like live tweeting. And then for people who aren't on Twitter, because they like, flounced, posting it to like Blue Sky and Threads. And it's just like watching this. This was on a Friday night too. This is literally Friday night. And of course, this is what I'm doing with my Friday night. I'm just watching this,
We
this
won't comment on
constellation.
that.
No, and it was just a you like I feel like sometimes I'm like meta watching it, right? I'm watching it from the standpoint of like what is happening here? What is like what can I take away from like these cultures interacting in these interesting ways? But also I have to say it was incredibly funny. Like that kid was just a crack interviewer. It was And then like I play Fortnite with my 11-year-old and I'm not as good as my 11-year-old. And so also watching this man try to play with this like, this kid.
Dad, do you have
I
Dad,
felt
do you have
it.
any
I really
idea
did.
do you have any idea what Fortnite is, Dad? Any idea?
No.
No, no ideas. I told you he's
I don't
got
need to.
absolutely no idea
You're
what Fortnite
you're
is.
young and sharp, and on top of this, I'm an old dinosaur.
Right.
But we need to get to questions because we're
Yeah.
getting late.
Yeah.
Renee, do you mind taking a couple questions from the
Yeah,
audience?
sure. Yep.
Okay. This is a combo question sort of from member James Lagruda and Alex Kawa. How do we combat disinformation while also protecting free speech?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is the question I think right now. So, like I mentioned with the Kennedy thing at the very start, taking it down doesn't work. People really want it to, and it really doesn't work. Because the thing that I was just describing, right, where there's all these like different constellations and communities across like 10 different platforms, you take somebody down off one, they're going to go reassemble on another. And then there's going to
Absolutely. That's a terrible
and that's
strategy.
and so really it is that but here's the flip side. The other answer, the answer that we used to, that's kind of like baked into the Constitution, right, is that you counterspeak. And the problem we have with social media right now is that the counter speech isn't seen. Like these things are not coming together. We're not having discourse, which is supposed to be the point.
Everyone's
And
in their bubble, right? Which is
yeah,
impenetrable.
right. And so there's people who are starting to look at ways to get around that. It's called bridging algorithms. And what this tries to do is instead of surfacing the most engaging content, it surfaces hot button issues. Like you can talk about abortion or whatever, but it'll try to surface people who have divergent points of view, but are not attacking the other side, but are just expressing strongly a different opinion. And you can kind of surface that type of content and try to, downrank essentially the more like belligerent, fighting oriented kind of stuff. Now, sometimes people hear downrank and they think, well, that's censorship too. I actually really disagree with that. And that's because every piece of content on the internet in a feed format is ranked in some way. There is something like there is a weighting determination that goes into everything. And so as long as the platform is transparent and it says like, hey, you can click into the bridging feed over here, I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to say like, this is what you're going to get when you're over here. If you want to be in like the jerks fighting on the internet feed, by all means, click this button. Takes you right there.
Yeah.
But I think that this is a way for us to try to get that together because you can't correct. Oh, the one other thing I'll say on the disinformation front, the sort of foreign actor piece, that's something where you do actually still see platforms just taking it down. And that's because those are inauthentic accounts. So it's not that they're saying something that somebody doesn't like. Again, it's not propaganda. It's explicitly inauthentic. And those accounts do come down still.
Yeah,
Right.
we've tried to establish our own niche on Lichtman Live. We started with nothing. We now have 168,000 subscribers, and our niche is
That's amazing.
we're entertaining. There's a lot of interplay between Sam and myself. You're only our second guest. We're just
Oh,
getting
no
into
kidding.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, only our second.
Congratulations.
Oh, that's
Well,
awesome.
third.
And
My mom was
what?
our first guest.
Oh, right, the
Yeah.
mom. Yes. Sam's mom is this brilliant political organizer. She codified as head of Maryland NARAL Roe versus Wade in
Oh,
Maryland
amazing.
in 1992, 32 years
Incredible.
ago. Any rate, so the other thing we have that I think is unique is the way we get into things in depth and including in historical depth. What other show would talk about Smedley Butler and the American Legion plot to overturn Franklin Roosevelt's government in 1934?
No, I love that stuff. I think that's this is the one thing where I struggled with, like, in the book I really wanted to make clear that I don't think new niche media is bad. It's there are bad actors within it, there are bad incentives within it, but there are Substacks out there where, or newsletters, ghost newsletters too, where you just find the most amazing stuff. People are just writing like things that they're just incredibly passionate about and have incredible expertise. And like, if you got that in a mainstream paper, you would be getting it much more as like an occasional feature, maybe a profile, maybe a deep dive. And so it's nice to have that ability to go and support those creators.
Yeah. Our next question is from Patrick Murray. They say, if we lose control of real facts, it alters our consciousness and we become more of an object. My question is, if we are controlled by misinformation coming from multiple different sources, social media, the government, what type of society will we see? Could it lead to a societal collapse or something we have never seen before?
The thing that I think about parallel wise is the pamphleteering wars after the launch of the printing press, but this time digital, so much faster. There have been these moments where information moved either very asynchronously and people had completely divergent perspectives of the world because of the way that information flowed. I think what's happening now though is there is a very identity based, like a very identity based appeals that are happening around it that I find troubling. It's part of your political identity now. Like, you are expected, in order to be a good Republican, you are expected to distrust these things, and
You have to be a climate denier to be a
yeah,
good,
right,
for example. You have to
otherwise,
deny all the science.
yeah, otherwise you seem like, I think Cass Sunstein's done some good writing, right, on the trend in which like groups move to extremes. That's what I think is the dangerous part, that you have all of these factions that are much more polarized, that are fighting in digital space, and you're starting to see people actually move off to completely divergent spaces because now we have technology that lets them do that. There's enough platforms where if you don't want to ever encounter a viewpoint that you don't like, you can actually do a pretty good job of making that happen. You can really go and use a shared block list to, summarily, on Blue Sky, for example, which I like a lot from a technological standpoint. I think it's the most interesting tech on the internet today. I think it's really a growing, thriving place. The political community that sort of settled it, if you will, was was fairly left, like lefty left, not like dem left. But as other people have moved over, you're starting to see different communities intersect. And it also has incredible feeds where you can really filter and shape and decide what you want to see. I think the risk of that is that you can filter out a whole lot of things, but the upside to it is you feel like you have a lot more agency and control over your experience.
Yeah.
We have more questions, I'm sure, Sam.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was going to get right to it, Dad.
No. I will say one thing.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Given a choice between a free government and a free press, I will take a free press, because unless we have accurate, truthful information, you cannot have a free government. That was Thomas Jefferson.
This question actually builds very well off of what you were just talking about, Renee. This is from Stat Brat Stacy. They say, when I call out Trump or Elon on social media, I'm automatically labeled a lib when I'm actually quite conservative. But I can see the obvious damage to our country being rolled out. Yeah. How do I change the mindset of Trumpsters that not everyone who isn't a Trumpster has valid gripes and fears?
Oh, I really do. I feel that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's hard. It's hard. I think, it feels very, I don't know. For me, it feels very narcissistic to say, like, as of this, I also think that this is bad, right? Because then you feel like you're like making a statement about yourself before getting to the point, and that always feels a little weird to me. But it is hey, listen, I think we really agree on these things, but when it comes to this, here's why I think it's bad. I mentioned my politically very diverse group chat in the RFK thing earlier on. We try to adhere to certain rules about staying curious, staying civil, assuming good faith. I think it's easier when you're in small groups. The problem with social media actually is that there's always a sense that you're performing for the people around you too, or that even if you're not performing, even if you're trying to have a genuine one-on-one interaction with somebody, that the bystanders are gonna, have an opinion. And I've definitely had moments where I'll post something, somebody from an obviously very divergent viewpoint responds. We start to have a back and forth, what I would consider to be a healthy disagreement. And someone else will come in thinking they're being helpful and will sort of jump down the person's throat. You're not wanted here. You should go back to X is something you'll see sometimes on Blue Sky or on other platforms. It'll be phrased in slightly different ways, but just ways of making them feel like it's not an open space for dialogue. And I think that unfortunately that, trying to remain patient and kind through those moments is very important.
Apropos of that comment, Donald Trump has called every judge who challenges something that he's done a wild-eyed liberal activist judge, even though some of these judges were appointed by Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and guess who? Donald Trump himself.
Yeah.
Perfect
This has been
example of
no,
what
this
the
was
caller
the
talking about.
I've been working on I've got an essay I gotta finish editing tonight, but it's on some of the dismantling of agencies created by Donald Trump to counter foreign interference in elections. This is something I'm writing about right now. And it's surreal to me because they all got reframed as these like crazy Bidenite censorship cabal machines. And I'm like, well, this was started by Christopher Wray. This was
Yeah.
started when this was a Trump appointee over here. This was started by Trump, and it's bad actually. It really reflects this willingness to just completely disregard the facts, or to not even it's not even the facts actually. It's just the sort of instantaneous rewrite of history to be more convenient.
You
That I
probably
think
have time, Renee, for
for one
one or
more.
two more questions for you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Try to make it quick, maybe.
Okay.
Jim Blowers wants to know, what do you think of Dan Ariely? I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right. And
Oh,
his book,
Ariely.
Ariely, and his book Misbelief.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I don't know if I've read that one, so I
Okay.
probably shouldn't weigh in. I think I've read excerpts, but not the whole thing.
Bert 10 says, can we use AI individually to counter disinformation?
Oh, there's some interesting work being done on that. Wonder if I can if you post this somewhere, I'll give it to you. You can toss it in the show notes. But there's papers that are starting to look at this because it turns out that large language models are very patient and they will continue to speak to people even when maybe another human interlocutor would have checked out or gotten frustrated. So there's actually ways. There's two things that I've seen that are interesting. One is having the chatbot try to help people work through conspiracy theories where they will ask it, well, I think the earth is flat. Well, why do you think that? Well, I think it because of this. Well, did you know, and so you can watch, there's a paper and it was either Science or Nature fairly recently where you can actually read the chat logs and see it do these things. And I think, again, the real value is that it's patient. The other thing that's interesting though, is that I am forgetting the proper name of this way of describing an argument. Starts with a T. It's a guy's name who came up with the concept, but you can describe the structure of an argument where you can ask somebody to explain, to essentially evaluate an argument from a logic and rigor standpoint and to point out the flaws in the argument. And this is another interesting thing where people will feel like they don't feel defensive because it's a computer doing it to them. They know that they're engaging with an AI. So
Yeah.
there's no loss of face or feeling that some human thinks you're stupid. And so when you go through this process, you can ask it, what is happening in this scenario, or what is happening in this argument. Sometimes you can even give it a meme, right? Eating the pets, for example, and it'll actually break down for you. This is the theory. These are the signifiers. This is where the argument falls apart. And so it's just an interesting way to teach people, rhetoric and structure
Yeah,
in
I've
ways
never
that
even
feel
thought about
engaging.
that before. That's really interesting. And I like ChatGPT a lot, and I've noticed some of the things that you've mentioned about it, that it's very patient and that, it'll talk you through things. But I never thought about it like concretely in fighting, rumors or
Very good
propaganda.
book that deals with that. It's old, but it's still excellent. It's called The New Rhetoric, and it deals with how you deal with and break down argumentation.
All right, we have
Oh,
just
10 o'clock, a little after.
I
All
was
Renee,
right.
I
so
was just
much.
about to say that, Dad. I was just about to
Oh,
say that. It's 10 o'clock.
I
Thank you.
know. Turns
Thank
your
you,
you know where your
Professor.
children are.
Yeah,
I know where mine is.
They are in bed, which means
nice.
I have like free time.
Nice. Well, speaking of free time, we talked about Invisible Rulers. I see it
Yep.
behind you. Everybody, I really, really recommend everybody read the book. You got anything new in the pipeline? A new book? Ideas for a book?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there's going to be some crazy stuff to write after the stuff that's happening now, but
Yeah.
I really want to write about smear campaigns. I think that's I'm doing some stuff on that. I felt
You
like,
can
again,
interview me.
I think anybody who's like been through it has a sort of fascinating experience. Again, looking at
Yes.
it almost on the outside of like what is happening here. And then the other thing, which is sort of a reaction to my experience dealing with like congressional committees and stuff, which is stories in the book. I've been reading House Un-American Activities Committee transcripts and research over the last couple of months, and so I have some essays, kind of comparing the present moment and some of the ways that some of what's happening in Congress has kind of eerie echoes back to the dynamics then.
Well,
Amazing.
look for your stuff.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. We appreciate
I
it.
appreciate it. Have
All
a
right.
great night.
A couple of housekeeping things, and then I will take 3 questions.
Okay. A couple of housekeeping things, and then Dad, you'll take 3 questions. All right, housekeeping things. First of all, I think that was a fantastic interview.
That was amazing. Yeah.
Renee, Professor DiResta is super smart. And like, everybody says like when someone has them on, you got to read their book. No, like really guys, you have to read her book. It's like, I think it's just like base understanding that every American needs to understand how information is working online right now. It's like, it's not like super complex. It's not a hard read. It's just like
Yeah,
this,
you saw how she explains things very clearly.
it's this like great base understanding of what the hell is happening in our media landscape right now. And I think everybody should read it. If you're currently watching, please throw the stream a like. We only have 484 likes and almost 1,000 people watching. Don't forget to subscribe. We're also on Twitch, twitch.tv/Allan Lichtman. Remember, if you wanted to get a question into Renee, you had to be a member or you had to donate. I think
And that
that's
keeps us alive, the memberships and the donations. There's a lot behind the scenes that goes into these shows.
Yeah.
It's not just Sam and I showing up, at this hour.
right. And you'll be interested. Actually, Savannah put up a poll while she was on. Where do you get your news? Of people watching, 46% of our viewers get their news from social media, which is exactly her expertise about how information spreads across social media. So,
All right, I'll take 3 questions.
Okay, 3 questions.
If you have them.
Oh, I got them, Dad.
You got them. You always got them.
This is from Crease. With so much historical analysis of fascism and dictator history, what analysis is there to effective opposition activities, historical examples?
Yeah. You've heard me say so many times, and maybe you haven't, but I'll say it again. It's not just the evil people who wreak havoc on this world. It's the good people who don't do enough to stop them. And, one of the reasons we are tilting towards authoritarianism is people did not take Trump seriously, although we've been shouting about that for a year. He means what he says. He's not joking. It's not just hyperbole. He's not just throwing things out. And now we're seeing the results of that. So the most critical thing is we all have to take it seriously. And then we have to act. And I've given a lot of advice, and I'm sure those in our audience have other advice of what you can do. Get out in the streets, demonstrate. That matters. Communicate with your members of Congress or the Senate. Organize people. Get out to vote. Lobby. Uh, if you have access to local newspapers, write up opinion pieces. There's a lot that can be done, but people have to do it.
Pierre Holmes asks, have you, and also with a $50 donation, thank you, Pierre. They say, have you read Bob Woodward's book, War? It details the Biden administration's handling of the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Woodward also gives an account on how Biden and his national security team possibly pulled Putin back from using nukes in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think I think the Biden and his team did two things. One, they pulled together the coalition of the West that stopped Putin from quickly conquering Ukraine. It couldn't have been just the United States. You had to bring in Europe. Donald Trump lies about the contributions that Europe has made to Ukraine. It's comparable or even greater than the contribution of the United States. And it was Biden and Biden alone, not Macron or, Trudeau or Angela Merkel. It was Biden. And as you say, too, a number of steps were taken by the Biden administration to keep this war from escalating into any kind of nuclear confrontation, including being measured in the kinds of weaponry that they made available to the Ukrainians.
Member Jay Mlewa says, in our history as a nation, has there been a president who, upon swearing in, presided over slashing the government in such speed and style?
Well, the most comparable would probably be Calvin Coolidge, Ronald Reagan's favorite president. He did cut back on government. He balanced the budget. In fact, he served in the middle 1920s. Balanced the budget. We had a surplus, but it was a tiny government in those days, on the order of $5 billion, even, accounting for inflation, it's hundreds of times greater than that today. But no president has been comparable to the slash and burn tactics of Donald Trump. So we have this waste and fraud, and they give you, these minuscule examples that are 0.001% of the budget. But they're not doing those kinds of surgical cuts. They're not targeting, what they see as individual, particular wasteful programs. They're taking a machete to the bone and sinew of the government, and we've never seen anything like that before. We thought, those of us who were around in the 1980s, that Ronald Reagan might do that, but he never did. Government spending kept going up during Reagan, and the major programs, defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, were not slashed.
Private CM says, does key 10 turn if Donald Trump gives up Ukraine to Putin? That's something that we didn't talk about today because we had Renee on. But yeah, give us your full reaction.
Again, the devil, you've heard me say this 100 times. The devil is always in the details, and I don't make hypothetical advance predictions about what may happen with the keys, but that is something to look at.
All
right, I think we're done.
Okay, we're done. With that, folks,
that was 4 questions, not 3. I'll take one more if you have one.
Let's see. Andrew says, what are your thoughts on the McKinley curse, which is that no Democrat has won in an open seat election when the Dems are the party in control of the White House?
Yeah, no, that's real, because an open seat election, you usually lose a bunch of keys because of that. You lose the incumbency key, and that is usually when you have a party battle. So you lose that key as well. It's very difficult to win open seat elections, as we saw in 2024, 2016, 2020, 2008. That's a very difficult thing, not just for Democrats, but for the party holding the White House.
All All right, with that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live for the night. But you know what the good news is?
You're on.
I'm on. The Lichtman Live post show is on right after that. I will pin it to the chat right now, and also the link to that is in the description of this video. We want to give a big shout out to Professor Renée DiResta for coming on the show. Again, her book is Invisible Rulers. Go on Amazon, go on Audible, go to your local bookstore, whatever you need to find it, go find it.
She was awesome, and she did something I've talked about a lot. She put it down where the goats can get it.
Yeah.
She really made it simple, compelling, and understandable, dealing with a very complex topic.
Yeah. Before we sign off, I want to give a shout out to our donations. Jeanette Zuluaga, Junaid Naik, Justin, and Comic Fan. Thank you all so much for your donations. All right, Dad, what are your final words to the people tonight?
Well, I hope you learned a lot about the importance of disinformation, which, as she pointed out, often starts with true believers and then gets manipulated and controlled by the elites for their own particular purposes. I thought her analysis of the eating and stealing of the dogs and cats and ducks was extremely constructive, and she did have some good ideas on how to combat disinformation.
All right. See everybody in the Lichtman Live post show. Say goodnight to the people, Dad.
Good night. We'll be on. We don't have a guest, but Sam and I will be on at the usual time, 9 p.m. on Tuesday.
Correct. Good night.
Good night.